Come along and join me today as I build this magical mushroom dice tower. With fairy magics and its own spot to store your dice, this dice tower is great. I started out with a scrap piece of MDF and I'm going to be making the main structure out of an old Pringles can, so I just marked out where that will roughly sit. And then roughly mark out the sort of shape that I want the base footprint of the entire thing to have. And then because this is MDF, we can just use a real sharp knife, come through and score it and snip away at the edges to create a nice subtle gradient. Originally I was going to put a tea light in here, but after testing the mechanics of the dice rolling, it doesn't really fit. So I stack up some XPS foam and I'm going to make some stones, just like I did on the angel diorama a couple of weeks ago. And then when I was making that a couple of weeks ago, I really liked the stone texture that I got using a brass wire brush. So I come through and do that again and really rough up and distress all of this stone texture. And when that's done, I fill in any gaps with some spackle filler, and that's real good looking. Originally you can see I had a little marked out entire floor that I carved by hand, and it ended up being covered up by the mechanism that rolls the dice. So that was a bit of a waste. But I still do use the offcuts of that to create little steps coming down that'll flow into the little garden out the front. And this Pringles can is a godsend. When making stuff like this, it's always good to work from a pre-constructed base, so that way you have a real strong thing to build on top of. So I'm just carving out the door here, and then I'll cut the entire thing in half, so that way I can cut out the windows real easy. And it doesn't matter if these cuts are rough or inaccurate, because they will be covered up later on with the clay of the texture on the outside. Now the dice rolling mechanic is really easy to do. I just cut a semicircle to fit up the top, and then I make one to fit down the bottom. So that way it'll roll down the top, and then it will hit the one at the bottom and roll out the front door. The one down the bottom though was giving me a lot of issues with this design. I ended up making much bigger one, much bigger than a semicircle, just to funnel it straight through the front door. And once they're stuck together, I glue together the original can shape and then stick that down onto our base. Give it a hefty amount of hot glue so that way it doesn't go anywhere. And then I add some aluminium foil for shaping down the bottom, because mushrooms are much bigger at the base. I then cut a donut shape, with the inner circle being the same size as the Pringles can tin, and the outer circle being made using a round bucket that's roughly the right size. And then that should fit on the top, and I give it a bit of a slant, just to make it look a bit more interesting. And use a lot of hot glue to keep that down as well. The main thing to be getting the texture and the shape and the girth of the mushroom base and the roof of it is air dry clay. I don't have anything proper to work with this really, so I just put down a piece of cardboard and roll it out with a paintbrush. Can then easily wrap it around this basic structure we have, add some mass and textures into this whole thing. And then using some smaller clay sculpting tools, you can really get some amazing textures out of this. After covering the entire thing, I come in with a slightly wet tool and carve in little details that kind of look like wooden trunks, like this is a real thick, big mushroom. And the more details in this, the better it's going to look. So I drill in some little holes and just go kind of crazy with the shape, as well as making sure to get the top of the roof or ceiling. And then to add even more details, I come in with a plastic brush and carve all over it. Making sure that the brush is a little bit wet, so that way it doesn't rip and tear chunks out of the entire clay piece. And just adds detail instead. And of course, it's a big mushroom, so there's probably small mushrooms next to it. So I work out a kind of technique to make them. I roll out a ball, and then I flatten it onto the bench and make it a little bit of a cone shape. And then for the root, I just roll out another flat ball. And that is the little mushroom. And for building the cap on the top, I just start with some rough foam pieces as a scaffolding almost that I carve in, and I carve out a round sort of semi-dome shape. It can be rough because it's going to be a natural sort of thing. It's not going to be perfect. I'm now running out of clay So I roll out the flattest sort of clay that I can get and flop that over our mold that I've covered in aluminium foil. If I was going to do this again, I'd definitely use a lot more clay, because you can see later on when it dries, it all starts to crack because the clay is too thin. But I was able to make it work in this instance. And then make sure to shape it in the sort of roughly sort of mushroom shape with a little bit of hangover over the edges. And once it's all kind of shaped out, it's really easy just to smooth out any lumps with just some wet fingers. While I'm waiting for the clay to dry, I start making these rounded river stones. Using a hole punch, I punch out circular pieces of foam and then texture them by tossing them in a tin with a bunch of rocks. And these, all stacked up, look great as a little fence. I then use a little bit of baking soda to give the floor a bit of texture, rather than that flat board look. I think that clay should be dry just about now, and it has a lot of cracks on it because it was not laid on thick enough. So I just use some spackle filler to fill all of those gaps, and hopefully we'll be able to salvage this. In an attempt to seal it and give it a bit more strength, I give it a few layers of PVA glue as well. And when I say a few layers, I mean like 5 layers on the inside and the outside. And this strategy works pretty well to make the outside a lot more elastic and rubbery. And talking about the outside of the top of the mushroom, we need a chimney coming out of the roof that we can put our dice into. So I just use a piece of single corrugated cardboard and measure it against a die to make a chimney that'll fit any sort of size. I then start marking out where that chimney is going to go in the total mushroom structure. I pick a point on the outside and then roughly correlate that to where it is on the inside and carve out and start removing a lot of that foam. I then cut an angled piece to size so that way when rolling the dice they'll roll down and into the center. And then I cut another piece that'll go on top of that facing directly upwards to make it look a bit more like a chimney. And then in yet another bid to try and make this a lot stronger, I just start filling it up with paper mache. And I do 2 layers of paper mache and then cover it with some PVA glue on top of that as well. It is pretty strong, all things considered. So the 2 pieces of the mushroom can slot together quite nicely, and also so dice don't go rolling out of the top. I cut this 1/2 inch piece of corrugated cardboard and run it along the edge of the bottom piece of the mushroom. I then start laying out a bunch of foam bricks to build up the chimney. When it gets to the point where it needs to be cut and go in a different direction, I cut the bottom pieces of the bricks. That way they line up with a line that I've drawn for the top parts of the bricks. And onto that line, just to clean up the edges, I add in these little pieces of wood. I don't know if it makes sense, but it looks pretty. As well as that, I add a little platform so you can sit your little miniature up there as well. And once I get to the top, I lay down some flagstones to make sure it looks like a proper, actual chimney. But it is very thick. I want to add some vines overgrowing over those rocks out the front. So I got some green stuff and rolled out a nice tube, and that'll be the main vine. Using a sharp tool to carve in some shapes to give it some texture. Vines of course have leaves, and I came up with a little idea for making leaves. First you make a little bean of green stuff, and then you make it sort of in a diamond shape by hardening the edges. And you draw a line straight down the center with your tool. And then from that center, you just drew a few lines coming off it, and that'll be the little leaf textures. And these leaves are really big, but I think they look pretty cool. I then use a thin piece of balsa wood for the gate out the front, make 2 gate poles on either side, and then use some popsicle stick to make the gates in the center. For a bit more detail, using just some green stuff rolled out in a flat sheet, I cut some hinges. And now it's time for painting. The basic structure, I start by covering it all in a black Mod Podge base coat, and that'll seal in the foam as well as seal in any of the sand and all the extra pieces that I put on. And once that is all dry, I go over and cover it all in a white spray paint, and that'll make painting it a lot easier. I start with the grey of the rocks and add in a bunch of colourful colours over that to make the rocks look magical. On the stones out the front, to make them look all different, I colour a bunch of them in brown, in green, in blue, in orange, and then a large majority of them in grey. And I do the same sort of thing with the chimney up the top. For painting the white of the mushroom, I mix together a fleshy, pale colour using white and raw sienna. And that mixes up really well to give this real pale sort of colour. Just like an off-white, like a beige. Once everything is dry, on all of the fleshy parts I come in with a brown wash, and on basically absolutely everything else I come in with a mix of black and brown wash. And this brown, I need to do 2 coats, but it really gets in all of the crevices, all the tiny details, and makes it really look real, gives it a lot of depth. It's crazy, it's so cool. To finish off the cap of the mushroom, I painted a really bright warm red, and all of the little splotches I paint in a flat white. After dry brushing everything, I come over and paint all of the green little details out the front, as well as painting the front gates in a burnt sienna. And then add the little red caps to the mushrooms outside. It's very important to do this after dry brushing. So you dry brush the roots and the grey colours all in their base tones to bring back highlights, and then you paint everything else. That way you're not covering up anything with your dry brush. I made these tiny little lanterns out of chain and just beads on the end painted yellow, so I screw those into the top of the cap of the mushroom. And these look great as just little extra details. And these white caps need several coats of white before they're even close. With all the painting done, it's time to add some flocking. I was going to add static grass, but that wouldn't allow the dice to sit very flat on the little garden out the front. So I just add some sawdust flock that is mixed with green, dark green, and yellow. And that's a really vibrant mix. I also add some single green on the outside of the rocks to act as a bit of a moss color. And this is a mushroom, but it doesn't really look magical. Not yet. I use some chalk pastels. I grab a magenta, a bright yellow, and a light blue. And I just take a bit of that off with a Stanley knife and then add it on and dab it in little places around the entire mushroom, and that looks like a fairy dust, some sort of magical energy, and that really brings it all together and ties it all together to look really magical, like a magical mushroom. And it is just so cool seeing the difference between it before and seeing it with all these magical powders floating around. And if you don't already, pick up some pigment powders or some chalk pastels, even cheaper, and turn them into your own pigment powders and add them to everything you can. They look so great and tie everything together. I didn't like how bare the front gates looked, so I added some wooden beads with some tacky glue just to add some more interest. And then I added in some green clump foliage and stuck in some little pink flowers into it. And that is our magical fairy mushroom house. Works perfectly as your dice roller as well as a dice storer. The top opens up, you can store dice in there, roll them straight into it. You could even get rid of the top piece, store it away, put it in the corner. but adding the top piece, it really does look great. Thanks for watching this far, and if you liked the video, like the video, and subscribe to see more next week.